Dinner that night started like any other. The dining table was set, candles flickered softly, and Mia hummed a tune while plating the roast chicken she'd been cooking all afternoon. The scene could have been pulled from a picture-perfect ad for domestic bliss. I was at the table with a glass of whiskey, savoring the warmth as it slid down my throat. For a moment, life felt calm, normal even. It was the kind of peace I'd taken for granted for years. Mia joined me with a bright smile, setting down the food before taking her seat. "Dig in," she said, her voice cheerful, almost too cheerful. I didn't think much of it at the time. Mia always prided herself on her cooking, and tonight was no exception. The air smelled of garlic, rosemary, and freshly baked bread, but beneath it, I sensed something else, an edge I couldn't quite place. We ate in silence for a while, the only sounds being the clinking of silverware and the occasional scrape of a plate. I thought about work, the usual stresses of life, and the odd tension that had been building between Mia and me over the past few months. She'd been more distant lately, her smile sharper, her words sometimes colder. I chalked it up to the monotony of life. Everyone went through rough patches, right? That's when she shattered everything. "Last night, I slept with Eric," she said, her tone as casual as if she were telling me she'd run into a friend at the grocery store. She took a sip of her wine, her eyes meeting mine without a hint of shame. "He was amazing in bed, so I'm planning to do it again." At first, I thought I'd misheard her. The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal, like a bad joke told in poor taste. I blinked, my fork halfway to my mouth, my mind racing to make sense of what she just said. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't even flinch. She placed her fork down neatly, wiped the corner of her mouth with a napkin, and looked at me as if I were the one acting strange. "Eric, you know, our neighbor," she said, her voice light, almost amused. "We've been sleeping together. It just happened." She shrugged, as though this was some minor inconvenience, like losing a sock in the laundry. I froze. The whiskey I'd been savoring caught in my throat, and I coughed violently, the burn of alcohol mixing with the sting of her words. My eyes watered as I struggled to catch my breath, but Mia didn't move to help. She just sat there, calm, composed, waiting for me to regain my composure. "You're kidding," I finally managed, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. "No," she said simply, picking up her fork again. "I'm not." My mind was a whirlwind. Memories flashed before me, the times Mia and Eric had exchanged friendly waves from across the driveway, the way she'd laugh a little too hard at his jokes during neighborhood gatherings, the afternoons they'd spent together working on community projects. I'd seen it all, but I'd never thought twice about it. Why would I? Eric was married, and so was Mia. I thought there were lines people didn't cross. I was wrong. "Mia," I said, my voice low and trembling. I wasn't sure what I was going to say next. What do you even say to something like that? How could you? "It's not a big deal," she interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "I mean, you're always so busy with work, and Eric, well, he's just more attentive, you know? He actually listens." Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. I stared at her, my mouth dry, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. How could she sit there so calmly, so casually, and tear apart everything we'd built together? "You're joking," I said again, though I knew she wasn't. "No, John," she replied, exasperation creeping into her tone. "Why are you making such a big deal out of this? It's not like I'm asking for a divorce. I'm just exploring. Don't you want me to be happy?" Happy. The word rang in my ears, mocking me. My fists clenched under the table, my nails digging into my palms. I wanted to yell, to scream, to flip the table and demand answers. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, frozen, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me like a physical force. Mia, meanwhile, kept eating, as if we were having a casual chat about weekend plans. She was so detached, so nonchalant, it made my stomach turn. I wanted to grab her plate and throw it against the wall, to shatter something, anything, to match the way I felt inside. But I didn't. I couldn't. My mind raced, jumping from one thought to the next. Did Eric's wife, Sophia, know? She was a lawyer, sharp and observant. Surely she would have noticed something. Or maybe she hadn't, just like I hadn't. And what about Eric? He'd always been friendly, too friendly, now that I thought about it. Had he been laughing at me this whole time, playing the good neighbor while sneaking into my home through my wife? Mia sighed, breaking the silence. John, don't look at me like that. It's not the end of the world. These things happen. People grow apart. I'm just being honest with you. Honest, I echoed, the word bitter in my mouth. Yes, she said firmly, meeting my gaze. Would you rather I lied to you? I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. I wanted to get up, to walk out of the room, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a complete dismissal of everything I thought we stood for. As Mia continued eating, completely unbothered, I realized something. This wasn't about a single night or a single affair. This was who she had become, cold, selfish, and utterly unrecognizable. That realization hit me harder than her confession ever could. By the time I reached Eric's front door, my hands were trembling, not with fear, but with the kind of rage that burns so hot it leaves you feeling cold. My thoughts were a storm of betrayal and humiliation, each one louder than the last. The image of Mia's calm, unapologetic face burned in my mind, her words echoing like a cruel taunt. Last night, I slept with Eric. Every step I'd taken across the driveway felt heavier, every breath sharper. I didn't even care that it was late. I didn't care that Sophia, Eric's wife, or even their kids, if they had any, might be home. I cared about one thing, making him face what he'd done. I didn't knock. Knocking was for neighbors, for friends, for people who had the decency to respect boundaries. Instead, I pounded on the door, my fist slamming against the wood like a hammer. The porch light flickered on, and after a moment, the door creaked open. Eric stood there, wearing a loose t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly tousled like he'd just gotten out of bed. His face, once the picture of easy confidence, twisted into something between surprise and unease when he saw me. John, he said, his voice cautious. What's going on? Is everything okay? The sheer audacity of him playing innocent made my blood boil. You know damn well what's going on, I growled, stepping forward. Eric blinked, his confusion too practiced to be genuine. I don't know what you're talking about. For a split second, I wondered if Mia had lied. Maybe she'd said it to hurt me, to provoke me into doing something irrational. But then I saw it, the flicker of fear in Eric's eyes, the way his hand gripped the edge of the door just a little too tightly. He knew. Don't, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Don't stand there and act like you don't know. John, he started, his tone placating. Look, if this is about something Mia said. Before he could finish, I shoved the door open and stepped inside, slamming it behind me. Eric stumbled back, his hands raised in a weak attempt at defense. The carefully curated calm he'd always worn, that smug charm, was starting to crack. You slept with my wife, I said, each word sharper than the last. You came into my home, sat at my table, smiled in my face, and slept with my wife. Eric backed up further, his expression shifting from confusion to panic. I don't know what she told you, but... I didn't let him finish. My fist connected with his jaw before I even realized I'd thrown the punch. The impact sent him stumbling into the wall, clutching his face. Jesus, John, he shouted, his voice muffled by his hands. What the hell's wrong with you? What's wrong with me? I roared, stepping closer. You slept with my wife, and you have the nerve to ask me that? Eric held up a hand, as if that pathetic gesture could somehow stop me. All right, he said quickly, his voice shaking. Just calm down, okay? Calm down? I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. You think I'm going to calm down after what you've done? He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the staircase like he was considering running. But he didn't. Maybe he knew he wouldn't get far. Maybe he knew I'd chase him. Instead, he leaned back against the wall, one hand still cradling his jaw. Okay, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Okay, fine. It's true. I slept with Mia. Hearing him say it didn't make it easier. If anything, it made the betrayal sharper, the humiliation deeper. I clenched my fists, resisting the urge to hit him again. But it wasn't what you think, he added quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. It didn't mean anything. It was a mistake. A stupid one-time thing. A mistake? I snapped. She told me she plans to do it again. Is that a mistake too? Eric's face went pale. She said that? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The look in his eyes told me he already knew the truth. John, please, he said, his tone shifting from defensive to pleading. Look, I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. It just happened. His excuses sounded hollow, pathetic. But it wasn't his apology I wanted. It was his fear. Does Sophia know? I asked coldly. Eric flinched at her name. No, he said quickly. She doesn't know. And she can't know. Please, John. If she finds out, he trailed off, his voice trembling. I stared at him. The man who had betrayed me, who had laughed with me over beers while sneaking around behind my back. Now, he was begging me to protect him, to keep his secret. You're worried about your wife finding out? I said, my voice dripping with disdain. What about my wife? What about what you did to me? I know, he said, his words desperate. I know I screwed up, okay? But Sophia, she'll leave me. She'll take everything. My job, my reputation, everything. The sheer audacity of his plea made me sick. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry he might get caught. Please, John, Eric said, his voice breaking. I'll do anything. Just don't tell her. I'll stay away from Mia. I'll never talk to her again. I swear. I stared at him, my mind racing. Telling Sophia would destroy his life, his marriage, his career, everything he'd built. But keeping his secret felt like betraying myself, like letting him win. The room was silent except for the sound of Eric's ragged breathing. I clenched my fists again, the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a stone. Stay away from Mia, I said finally, my voice cold and steady. Because if I see you near her again, I won't stop at one punch. Eric nodded quickly, relief flooding his face. But as I turned to leave, one thought burned in my mind. Sophia deserved to know the truth. As I walked out into the night, the moral dilemma twisted inside me. Destroying Eric's marriage would be justice, but at what cost? Could I live with myself if I let him off the hook? Could I live with myself if I didn't? The door slammed behind me, but the weight of his betrayal followed me home. The drive back home felt surreal. The quiet hum of the engine was at odds with the storm raging in my chest. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, the sting of Eric's confession and his pathetic pleas still fresh in my mind. Every mile brought me closer to the home Mia and I had built together. A home that now felt hollow, a mockery of the life I thought we shared. The second I pulled into the driveway, I knew what I had to do. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. This wasn't just about what Mia had done. It was about taking control of my life, of my dignity, and making it clear that her betrayal had consequences. I walked straight to the front door and locked it behind me, the sound of the bolt sliding into place echoing in the empty house. It was symbolic, almost poetic. Mia was no longer welcome in the life she had so carelessly destroyed. I strode to my desk in the study and pulled out the spare keys. The locks would be changed before the night was over. The next call I made was to my financial manager. I explained the situation in as few words as possible, my tone sharp and unyielding. Freeze the accounts. All of them, I said, my voice low but firm. Are you certain? He asked, clearly surprised by the sudden request. Do it now, I snapped, barely holding back the anger simmering beneath the surface. She gets nothing. Not a cent. I hung up before he could respond, the weight of the action settling over me like a cold but necessary blanket. Mia had always had free access to my finances, trusting me to handle everything while she spent as she pleased. That trust was gone now. With the accounts frozen, I called a locksmith. It was late, but I didn't care. I needed the locks changed tonight. The man on the other end of the line tried to tell me he couldn't come until morning, but there must have been something in my voice that changed his mind. When the locksmith arrived, I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, as he worked. The metallic clicks and grinding sounds of the lock being replaced were oddly satisfying, like the first steps of purging Mia from my life. "Bad break-in?" the locksmith asked casually as he worked. "Something like that," I replied, not elaborating. Once he was finished, I handed him cash and locked the door behind him. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over something, no matter how small. The locks were new, the accounts were frozen, and Mia was officially shut out. It wasn't long before she returned. I'd barely sat down with another glass of whiskey when I heard her car pull into the driveway. The sound of her footsteps was light at first, almost hesitant, but then came the sharp knock on the door. "John?" Her voice was muffled but unmistakable. "What's going on? Why is the door locked?" I didn't answer. I just sat there, swirling the amber liquid in my glass, staring at the wall as her knocking grew louder. "John, open the door," she called, her tone shifting from confusion to frustration. "What are you doing?" I finally stood, walking slowly to the door but not opening it. Instead, I spoke through the barrier, my voice cold and steady. "You're not welcome here anymore, Mia." There was a pause, and then she laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "What are you talking about? Stop being ridiculous and open the door." "Ridiculous?" I repeated, my tone sharp. "You think I'm being ridiculous? You slept with our neighbor, Mia. You told me, at our dinner table, as if it was nothing. And now you think you can just waltz back in here like everything's fine?" Her voice cracked. "John, I made a mistake. I didn't mean—" "Don't," I cut her off. "Don't you dare try to spin this. You knew exactly what you were doing." "Please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Can we just talk about this? You're overreacting." I laughed bitterly. "Overreacting? You think changing the locks and freezing the accounts is overreacting? Mia, this is just the beginning." She banged on the door, harder this time. "John, you can't do this. This is my house too." "Not anymore," I said firmly. "You made your choice, Mia. Now you get to live with it." Her pleas continued, growing more desperate, but I didn't falter. I turned my back on the door and walked away, letting her voice fade into the background. Every step I took felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, a small but significant victory over the chaos she had unleashed. The next morning, I was at my lawyer's office as soon as they opened. The receptionist seemed surprised to see me so early, but I didn't care. I didn't even sit down in the waiting room, pacing instead as I waited for my appointment. When the lawyer finally called me in, I wasted no time. "I want to file for divorce," I said, my voice firm. He nodded, pulling out a notepad. "What grounds?" "Adultery," I replied without hesitation. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing, jotting down notes as I laid out the situation. By the time I walked out of his office, the paperwork was in motion. The legal process would take time, but the first step had been taken. That evening, Mia returned again, standing on the porch, her face pale and tear-streaked. "John, please," she begged, her voice hoarse. "We can fix this. I made a mistake, but I love you." I opened the door just enough to meet her eyes, my expression cold and unyielding. "Go back to wherever you stayed last night, Mia. This isn't your home anymore." She opened her mouth to argue, but I didn't give her the chance. I closed the door in her face, locking it behind me without a second thought. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my life again. Mia thought she could betray me and get away with it, but she underestimated me. This was just the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Mia's betrayal and Eric's cowardly confessions played in my mind on an endless loop, like a broken record I couldn't shut off. The house, now eerily quiet with Mia locked out, felt suffocating despite the empty space. I poured myself drink after drink, trying to dull the pain, but it was no use. By the time the sun rose, I had made up my mind. Eric wasn't getting away with this. Not with his fake apologies, not with his pathetic pleas to keep it a secret. His wife, Sophia, deserved to know the truth. It wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about justice, about breaking the cycle of deceit and giving her the chance to decide what to do with her life, armed with the truth Eric had tried to bury. Sophia and I had never been particularly close, but she was polite and professional whenever I saw her. She worked as a lawyer at a prestigious firm downtown, her sharp intellect evident in every conversation. If anyone could handle the weight of what I was about to tell her, it was Sophia. By mid-morning, I was parked outside her office, a sleek glass building that towered over the bustling city streets. I hesitated for a moment, the gravity of what I was about to do sinking in. This wasn't just some petty gossip. This was a bomb that would detonate her marriage. But Eric had left me no choice. He'd done this to himself. And Sophia? She deserved better. I stepped inside the lobby, where the cool air and polished floors seemed to amplify my nervous energy. The receptionist looked up as I approached, her professional smile fading slightly when she saw my expression. "I need to speak with Sophia Carter," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the storm brewing inside me. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked politely. "No, but it's urgent," I replied. "Tell her it's about her husband. She'll want to hear this." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded and picked up the phone. After a brief, hushed conversation, she hung up and gestured toward a private meeting room. "Mrs. Carter will see you shortly." Sophia entered the room a few minutes later, her heels clicking against the tiled floor with precision. She was as composed as ever, dressed in a tailored navy suit that exuded confidence. Her expression, however, betrayed a flicker of concern. "John," she said, her tone measured. "This is unexpected. What's going on?" I stood, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. "Thank you for seeing me, Sophia. I know this isn't the best way to approach you, but I didn't think it could wait." Her eyes narrowed slightly, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "All right, what's this about?" "It's about Eric," I said, the words heavy in my throat. "And Mia." For a moment, her composure didn't waver. "Go on," she said, her tone carefully neutral. I took a deep breath and started from the beginning. I told her about Mia's confession over dinner, about how she casually admitted to sleeping with Eric and planned to continue. I recounted my confrontation with Eric, how he tried to deny it until I punched him and forced the truth out of him. Sophia's expression remained unreadable as I spoke, her sharp eyes fixed on mine. But as I described Eric's cowardly pleas for me to keep it a secret, I saw a flicker of something in her gaze. Anger, cold and calculated, simmering beneath the surface. When I finished, the room was silent. Sophia leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her mouth as she processed everything I just told her. "You're sure?" she asked finally, her voice low and even. "I'm sure," I said, sliding my phone across the table. "I recorded the confrontation. I wasn't planning to use it, but I thought you'd need proof." She picked up the phone, her expression hardening as she listened to the audio. Eric's voice, shaky and full of excuses, spilled out into the room. "Please, John, don't tell her. She'll leave me. She'll take everything. I'll stay away from Mia, I swear. Just don't tell Sophia." Sophia set the phone down with a deliberate slowness, her lips pressed into a thin line. "He begged you not to tell me?" I nodded. "He's terrified of what you'll do." She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "He should be." What struck me most about Sophia's reaction wasn't her anger. It was her control. She didn't cry, she didn't yell, and she didn't crumble under the weight of her husband's betrayal. Instead, she shifted into a mode I could only describe as surgical. "Thank you for telling me, John," she said, her voice calm but icy. "Most people wouldn't have the guts to come forward like this, especially not when it involves their own pain." "You deserve to know," I said simply. She nodded, her gaze distant as she began to formulate her next steps. "He thinks he's invincible," she murmured, almost to herself. "Always has. But this is a mistake he won't recover from." I watched as she pulled out her phone and began making calls, her voice crisp and professional as she scheduled meetings and forwarded documents. It was clear that she wasn't just going to confront Eric. She was going to dismantle him. "Do you want me to leave?" I asked, unsure if she wanted privacy for what came next. Sophia glanced up, her expression softening slightly. "No, stay. You've already been dragged into this mess, and you deserve to see how it ends." For the next hour, I sat across from her as she worked, her calm fury a stark contrast to the chaos I'd felt the night before. She didn't lash out or make empty threats. Every move she made was calculated, every word deliberate. When she finally looked up, there was a glint of determination in her eyes. "Eric has no idea what's coming," she said. "By the time I'm done, he won't have anything left to beg for." As I left her office, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. Eric thought he could manipulate me into keeping his secret, but now his worst nightmare was coming true. Sophia wasn't just going to confront him. She was going to make him pay for every lie, every betrayal. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like justice was within reach. I thought changing the locks and freezing the accounts would give me the peace I needed to rebuild, but I underestimated Mia. She wasn't going to let go of the narrative or her role in my life without a fight. Where I thought she might retreat in shame or reflect on her actions, she did the opposite. She picked up the wreckage of her betrayal and tried to reshape it into something that made her the victim. It started small, just a few texts and calls to mutual friends. I didn't think much of it at first. Then, a longtime friend of ours, Darren, called me one evening, his voice laced with concern. "John," he began cautiously, "I heard some things from Mia, and I just wanted to check in with you." I tensed. "What things?" He hesitated. "Well, she said you've been controlling. That you've always been controlling, and that's why she felt so suffocated in the marriage. She claims that's why she, confessed. She said she couldn't take it anymore." My stomach twisted, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Controlling?" I said, my voice tight. "Are you serious, Darren? She cheated on me, with the neighbor, and somehow I'm the bad guy?" I know, he said quickly, clearly uncomfortable. I thought you should know. She's been reaching out to people, trying to get her side of the story out there." I clenched the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Mia wasn't just spinning a narrative, she was rewriting history. And the worst part? Some people were starting to believe her. Over the next week, the whispers turned into full-blown conversations. Friends and family members began calling, texting, or worse, avoiding me altogether. Some offered support, but others came armed with thinly veiled accusations. "John," my sister Anna said one afternoon, "Mia told me she admitted the affair because she felt trapped. She said you were so controlling she couldn't breathe." I stared at her, incredulous. Trapped? Mia's had access to everything. My finances, my schedule, my life. What part of that is controlling? Anna hesitated, her brow furrowed. "I'm just telling you what she said. She's painting a very different picture of your marriage." The manipulation was classic Mia. Subtle, insidious, designed to make people question me while she painted herself as the noble, guilt-ridden wife. It wasn't enough that she betrayed me. Now she wanted to twist the knife by tarnishing my reputation. The real blow came when my mother called. She'd always been fond of Mia, often defending her even when she didn't deserve it. But this time, her words cut deeper than I expected. "John, sweetie, I'm worried about you," she said gently. "Mia told me you've been distant, that she's been struggling for a long time, and she felt like she couldn't talk to you. Did you know she's been seeing a therapist?" "A therapist?" I repeated, disbelief washing over me. "Since when?" She didn't say, but she mentioned it was to help her cope with how controlling you've been. "I just want to make sure you're okay, and that you're not letting anger cloud your judgment." "Mom," I said sharply, "she cheated on me, with our neighbor, and she admitted it like it was nothing. How is that my fault?" "I'm not saying it's your fault," she said hesitantly. "I just think there are two sides to every story." Two sides. That phrase haunted me for days. Mia's lies were spreading like wildfire, turning friends and family into unwitting accomplices in her campaign to vilify me. For every person who stood by me, there seemed to be another who questioned my side of things, as if Mia's calm delivery somehow erased her betrayal. The breaking point came when Darren called again, his tone hesitant but serious. "John, there's something else you should know." I sighed, exhausted. "What now, Darren?" "I was talking to my wife about all this, and, well, she told me something I didn't know. She said Mia's been involved with other men before Eric." The air left my lungs. What are you talking about? Apparently, Mia had a fling with someone she worked with a couple years ago, Darren continued. My wife overheard it at a dinner party. They didn't name names, but it was clear they were talking about Mia. I sat there, stunned. If what Darren was saying was true, Mia's affair with Eric wasn't a one-off mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a pattern, a lifestyle, and I'd been blind to it. That night, I sat alone in the house, replaying every interaction, every moment that now felt tainted. How many times had I dismissed her late-night outings as innocent? How many excuses had I believed without question? The betrayal cut deeper than I'd realized, not just because of what Mia had done, but because of how long she'd been doing it. Eric was just the tip of the iceberg, and I was left wondering how many lies had gone unnoticed, how many moments of deceit had slipped past me under the guise of trust. But as the anger and hurt settled into a simmer, I made a decision. I couldn't control what Mia said or how people perceived her lies, but I could control my response. I wasn't going to let her narrative define me. I wasn't going to play her game. The next morning, I started reaching out to the people who mattered most, setting the record straight. For every lie Mia spread, I countered with the truth. I didn't raise my voice or stoop to her level. I let the facts speak for themselves. And as the days went on, the tide began to turn. Mia's manipulation had worked for a time, but the cracks in her story were beginning to show. People started asking questions, noticing inconsistencies. And me? I focused on rebuilding, determined not to let her lies dictate my future. I didn't hear from Sophia for a few days after I told her the truth about Eric's affair with Mia. Honestly, I wasn't sure what to expect. The Sophia I'd seen in her office was calm, methodical, and frighteningly focused. She wasn't the type to scream or throw things. She was the type to dismantle a problem piece by piece, quietly and efficiently. When I finally did get an update, it wasn't from her. It was from Eric. It was early in the morning, and my phone buzzed with a text. The name on the screen made my stomach turn. Eric Carter. John, please. Can we talk? I stared at the message, a bitter smile curling my lips. He was desperate. Good. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. Whatever Sophia was doing, it was working. Later that day, I ran into Sophia unexpectedly. She was standing in her driveway, supervising a moving truck as the workers loaded boxes into the back. She was impeccably dressed, as usual, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she directed them with cool precision. Big move? I asked as I approached, keeping my tone light. Sophia turned to me, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. Temporary, she replied. Eric's staying in the house for now. I thought it would be poetic to give him the space he's so clearly been enjoying. I raised an eyebrow. You're leaving him the house? For now, she said with a shrug. It'll be sold during the divorce proceedings. But I want him to sit in it for a while, alone, with no one to distract him from what he's done. Let him feel the weight of his choices. Her voice was calm, almost serene, but there was an edge to it, sharp and unforgiving. Sounds like you've got it all planned out, I said, impressed despite myself. Sophia's smile widened slightly. Oh, I do. The full scope of her plan came into focus over the next few days. Eric's world wasn't just crumbling. It was being systematically dismantled by the woman he'd underestimated. Sophia filed for divorce with speed and precision, leveraging every ounce of her legal expertise to ensure Eric came out of it with nothing. His bank accounts were frozen, his access to joint assets cut off, and his credit cards canceled. The house he thought he'd keep was placed on the market, with Sophia holding the lion's share of the equity. Word of the divorce spread quickly. In a neighborhood like ours, gossip moved faster than wildfire. Everyone knew about Eric's affair, thanks to Sophia's calculated leaks to a few key neighbors. By the time the story reached the wider social circle, Eric's reputation was in tatters. His smug charm, the same charm he'd used to seduce Mia, was nowhere to be seen. He avoided eye contact with me whenever our paths crossed, his shoulders hunched and his steps hurried. He looked like a man who had lost everything, and he had. Sophia's next move was unexpected but brilliantly executed. She confronted Mia directly. I wasn't there to witness it, but I heard about it through the grapevine. And from Mia herself, who showed up at my door that evening, visibly shaken. "John," she said, her voice trembling. "Sophia came to see me today." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "And?" Mia hesitated, her eyes darting nervously. "She told me to stay away from Eric. She said she'd ruin me if I didn't." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely curious. "Ruin you? How exactly?" "She said she knows people," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That she could make my life miserable if I don't back off." "Sounds like good advice," I said coldly. "You should take it." Mia's expression shifted, anger flashing in her eyes. "You don't understand, John. She's serious. She's threatening me." "Good," I replied, my tone as sharp as a blade. "You deserve it." Mia stared at me, clearly expecting me to defend her. When it became obvious I wasn't going to, she turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering something under her breath. What I later pieced together from various sources, including Sophia herself, was that their confrontation had been nothing short of masterful. Sophia hadn't yelled or made a scene. Instead, she'd met Mia for coffee, maintaining the appearance of civility while delivering a warning that left no room for misinterpretation. "You've already caused enough damage," Sophia had said, her tone calm but icy. "You're reckless, selfish, and completely blind to the consequences of your actions. But let me be clear. If you so much as look at Eric again, I will destroy you. Socially, financially, legally. You won't have a life left to crawl back to." Mia, used to manipulating people with her charm and tears, had no defense against Sophia's calculated precision. She left that meeting pale and shaken, finally realizing she'd tangled with someone far out of her league. Over the next few weeks, Sophia's revenge unfolded like a chess game, each move deliberate and devastating. Eric's career, already on shaky ground, took a nosedive as whispers of his affair reached his colleagues. He was passed over for a promotion he'd been counting on, and the rumor mill ensured his reputation was permanently stained. As for Sophia, she remained unshaken. If anything, she seemed to thrive in the aftermath, using the situation to remind everyone why she was a force to be reckoned with. She made it clear that while Eric's betrayal had hurt her, it hadn't broken her. And me? Watching Eric's world fall apart brought a sense of justice I hadn't thought possible. Sophia wasn't just settling a score, she was sending a message. To Eric, to Mia, and to anyone else who thought they could cross her without consequences. One evening, I ran into Sophia again as she walked her dog down the street. She looked as composed as ever, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Everything okay?" I asked, falling into step beside her. She glanced at me, her smile widening slightly. "Better than okay," she said. "Justice is a beautiful thing, isn't it?" I couldn't argue with that. When the dust began to settle, I realized that my life, as I'd known it, was over. But for the first time in weeks, or maybe years, I didn't feel like that was a bad thing. With Mia out of the house and the toxic web of lies she and Eric had spun beginning to unravel, I found myself standing in the ruins of a life I didn't even recognize. It was time to rebuild, not for anyone else but for myself. The first thing I did was dive headfirst into work. It was the one place where things still made sense, where my skills and effort were valued, untainted by betrayal or manipulation. I threw myself into projects with a renewed focus, taking on challenges I might have shied away from before. My colleagues noticed the change. "You've been on fire lately, John," my manager said during a team meeting. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." I nodded, offering a tight smile. They didn't know what I'd been through, and I wasn't about to share. Work became my sanctuary, a place where I could channel my energy and regain a sense of control. Outside of work, I began reconnecting with parts of myself I'd lost during my marriage. Hobbies I'd abandoned to keep Mia happy, running, woodworking, playing guitar, all found their way back into my life. I dusted off the old guitar I tucked away in the closet years ago and spent hours relearning the songs I used to love. The calluses on my fingers returned, a small but satisfying reminder that I was reclaiming pieces of myself. I also started reaching out to friends I hadn't seen in ages. Darren, despite his earlier hesitation, became a reliable presence, often joining me for drinks or a round of golf. My sister Anna, after some initial awkwardness, apologized for doubting me and became one of my strongest supporters. Slowly but surely, my world began to expand beyond the shadow of Mia's betrayal. One afternoon, as I was working on a report at home, my phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "Have a minute? I've been thinking about a few things." We hadn't spoken much since she served Eric with divorce papers, but I appreciated her message. Sophia had a way of cutting through the noise, her sharp mind and no-nonsense demeanor grounding me in ways I hadn't expected. "Sure," I replied. "What's on your mind?" Within minutes, she called. "I've been reviewing some of Eric's financials," she began, skipping the pleasantries. "I think there's more going on than we initially realized." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "I'm not just talking about his affair," she said. "There are irregularities in his accounts that suggest he might have been hiding money, possibly even misusing joint funds. I thought you'd want to know, considering Mia's involvement." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Eric and Mia weren't just reckless, they were potentially dangerous. "What do you suggest we do?" "Meet up," she said firmly. "I have some ideas, but we need to strategize." We met at a quiet cafe the next evening. Sophia came prepared, her laptop and a neatly organized folder of documents spread across the table. As she walked me through her findings, I was struck by how methodical she was, her sharp intellect cutting through the chaos like a scalpel. "What's your endgame here?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Protection," she said simply. "For both of us. People like Eric and Mia don't just disappear quietly. They'll try to twist things, spin their own narrative. We need to be prepared." Her words resonated. For the first time, I felt like I had someone in my corner who truly understood what I was up against. As Sophia and I spent more time together, something unexpected began to happen. Our conversations, initially focused on Eric and Mia, started to shift. We talked about our careers, our hobbies, our pasts. I learned that Sophia loved to hike on weekends, that she'd once dreamed of becoming a writer, and that she had an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure legal cases. She had a quick wit that caught me off guard, her dry humor often breaking the tension of our discussions. One evening, after a particularly long strategy session at her house, she poured us both a glass of wine and sat back with a tired smile. "You know, John," she said, "for someone who's been through hell, you're handling this remarkably well." I laughed, shaking my head. "Trust me, it doesn't feel that way most days." "Well, you're doing better than Eric," she quipped, raising her glass. Which, admittedly, isn't a high bar. We both laughed, the moment lighter than anything I'd experienced in weeks. For the first time in a long time, I felt something stir in me, something I wasn't sure I was ready to name. But we were both cautious. Neither of us said anything about the growing connection between us, though it hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Sophia was still navigating her divorce, and I was barely beginning to process my own. The wounds were too fresh, the timing too uncertain. Still, there were moments, like when our hands brushed as we reached for the same document, or when her laugh lingered just a little too long, that made me wonder if there was something more waiting for us on the other side of all this chaos. Working with Sophia gave me a sense of purpose, but it also reminded me of something I hadn't felt in years: hope. Hope for a future that wasn't defined by betrayal or pain. Hope for a life that felt like mine again. As I left her house that evening, the cool night air brushing against my face, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was rebuilding. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't doing it alone. The whispers started quietly at first, like the rustling of leaves before a storm. By the time the scandal reached its peak, it was no longer whispers but a full-blown uproar. The Carter house, once the pride of the neighborhood with its perfectly manicured lawn and pristine white shutters, became the epicenter of humiliation, judgment, and ridicule. Eric's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and the debris was scattered for everyone to see. With Sophia gone, the house felt hollow. The silence inside mirrored the growing void in Eric's life. He spent his days pacing the empty rooms, clutching his phone as though it might ring with good news. It didn't. His financial troubles had mounted rapidly after Sophia froze their accounts. His credit cards were canceled, His business contacts stopped returning his calls, and the looming threat of divorce court hung over him like a guillotine. What made it worse, what gnawed at Eric relentlessly, was the knowledge that he'd done this to himself. Every decision, every reckless action, had led him here. He was a man who thrived on charm, and now he had none left to give. The drinking started innocently enough, a beer here, a glass of whiskey there. But as the days passed, it became a crutch. By the second week of Sophia's absence, Eric was drinking heavily, his once polished demeanor giving way to disheveled hair, bloodshot eyes, and the faint stench of desperation. The neighbors noticed. They always did. Eric had once been the life of every barbecue, the charming storyteller with a glass of wine in hand and a laugh that drew everyone in. Now, he was the subject of hushed conversations behind closed doors. The breaking point came late one evening when Eric, fueled by alcohol and anger, stormed across the street to John's house. The doorbell rang insistently, its sharp chime echoing through the night. John opened the door cautiously, his expression unreadable. Eric stood on the porch, swaying slightly, his face flushed from a toxic mix of alcohol and rage. "This is all your fault," Eric slurred, pointing a shaky finger at John. John didn't move, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "Go home, Eric." "No," Eric bellowed, stepping closer. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Coming into my house, ruining my life, turning Sophia against me." John's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "You ruined your own life, Eric. I didn't make you sleep with Mia. I didn't make you betray your wife. That was all you." Eric's face twisted, a mix of fury and desperation. "You don't get it, do you? You think you're better than me? You think you're innocent in all this?" John stepped out onto the porch, his posture calm but firm. "I'm not innocent," he said evenly, "but I didn't lie to my wife. I didn't cheat. And I didn't make excuses for my mistakes." Eric's hands balled into fists, his entire body trembling. For a moment, it looked like he might throw a punch. But before he could, John took a step back, his voice cold and resolute. "I'm not going to fight you, Eric," John said, "because you're not worth it." The words hit harder than any punch could. Eric's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. He turned without another word, stumbling back across the street, his shadow stretching long and lonely under the dim streetlights. The neighborhood was buzzing the next morning. Someone had seen Eric pounding on John's door, and word spread quickly. It wasn't long before the full story, Eric's affair, his divorce, and his confrontation with John, was the only topic of conversation. At first, Mia tried to play the victim, telling anyone who would listen that she'd been misunderstood, that her marriage to John had been a prison. But the neighbors weren't buying it. Her association with Eric had tainted her reputation, and her lies couldn't withstand the scrutiny of a community that now saw her as complicit in Eric's downfall. Eric and Mia became pariahs. Invitations to neighborhood gatherings stopped coming. People crossed the street to avoid speaking to them. Even the local barbecues, once a staple of their social life, now felt like hostile territory. Sophia, on the other hand, was a different story. The neighborhood rallied around her, admiring her poise and strength in the face of betrayal. She became something of a legend, the one who took Eric Carter down, and her absence from the house only added to her mystique. By the end of the month, Eric was a shadow of his former self. His job, once his pride and joy, was gone. His wife had left him. His social circle had evaporated. Even Mia, the woman he'd risked everything for, had distanced herself, realizing too late that aligning with him had been a mistake. The Carter house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now stood as a silent reminder of his failures. The blinds were perpetually drawn, the yard overgrown, the mailbox stuffed with unopened bills. John watched it all unfold from a distance, his emotions a mix of satisfaction and pity. Eric had brought this on himself, but watching someone's life crumble wasn't as satisfying as John had imagined. One evening, as John sat on his porch, sipping a beer, Sophia stopped by on her evening walk. "It's quiet over there now," she said, nodding toward the Carter house. John shrugged. He got what he deserved. Sophia smiled faintly, her expression contemplative. Sometimes justice isn't as clean as we'd like it to be. John nodded, taking another sip. No, it isn't. But at least it's justice. Eric's downfall was complete, his world reduced to ruins of his own making. For John and Sophia, it was a stark reminder of the power of truth and the cost of betrayal. I had expected Mia to slink away quietly after everything fell apart. She had her choices, her lover, and her so-called freedom. But true to her nature, Mia wasn't one to accept defeat. Not when there was a chance to manipulate her way back into control. Her desperation, though pitiful, was a testament to how much she underestimated me. It started with a knock on the door one late afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I opened it cautiously, only to find Mia standing on the porch. She looked disheveled, her usually flawless makeup smeared, and her eyes rimmed red as if she'd been crying for hours. "John," she said softly, her voice trembling, "can we talk?" I stood there, unmoving, the sight of her bringing back a flood of emotions, none of them pleasant. "What do you want, Mia?" I asked coldly. "I want to fix this," she said, stepping closer. "I made a mistake, John. I was confused. I wasn't thinking straight." I laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Confused? You weren't confused when you told me at dinner that you planned to keep sleeping with Eric. You weren't confused when you lied to me for months. Don't insult me by pretending this was some lapse in judgment." Her face crumpled as tears began streaming down her cheeks. "I was wrong, okay? I see that now. But we had something, John. We can have it again. I love you." Her words hit me like a dull hammer. Not because they were convincing, they weren't, but because of the sheer audacity of her trying to frame this as a misunderstanding. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "If you loved me, Mia, you wouldn't have done what you did. You wouldn't have laughed in my face while you humiliated me. Love isn't what you feel for me. It's what you use to manipulate people." She flinched, her tears coming harder now. "That's not fair, John. I made a mistake, but we've been through so much together. Doesn't that count for anything?" "What counts," I said, my voice sharp, "is that you destroyed everything we built together for a cheap thrill. You didn't just betray me, Mia. You betrayed yourself." Mia tried every angle to worm her way back into my life. She called me incessantly, leaving voicemails filled with apologies and promises to change. She sent long, rambling text messages about how she'd always loved me, how she was willing to go to therapy, how we could start over. When none of that worked, she shifted tactics, trying to guilt me instead. "Do you really want to throw away all the years we spent together?" One of her messages read. "Do you want to be alone forever, John? You'll never find anyone who understands you like I do." Another time, she showed up at my office unannounced, causing a scene in the lobby. She cried and pleaded, begging for just 5 minutes of my time. I didn't give her even one. Her persistence might have worn down the old version of me, the man who once bent over backward to keep her happy. But I wasn't that man anymore. Her betrayal had forged something stronger, sharper in me, a version of myself who refused to be manipulated. The next time she called, I answered, not to engage, but to end things once and for all. "Mia," I said firmly, cutting her off mid-sentence, "this isn't going to work. You don't love me. You love control. And now that you've lost it, you're panicking. That's not my problem. It's yours." Her sobs filled the line, but I didn't waver. "We're done," I said, my tone final. "Stop calling me, stop texting me, and stop showing up at my door. You made your choice. Live with it." I hung up, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. For the first time in months, I wasn't just reacting to her manipulations. I was in control. Word spread quickly about Mia's situation. Without access to our joint accounts, she was struggling financially. Her friends, the same ones who had encouraged her reckless behavior, were nowhere to be found. They had distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone so publicly disgraced. She moved out of the house we had once shared, though it was unclear where she went at first. Then, through mutual acquaintances, I learned she had moved in with her sister, a woman she barely got along with under normal circumstances. Mia's sister, Laura, was known for her bluntness and lack of patience. It wasn't long before I heard through the grapevine that their living arrangement was tense. Laura didn't hesitate to call Mia out for her mistakes, reminding her daily of the mess she'd made of her life. "Mia's not doing well," Darren told me one evening over drinks. "She's completely isolated. Laura's basically her only lifeline, and even she's losing patience." I listened quietly, sipping my beer. I didn't feel satisfaction or pity, just a sense of closure. Mia's downfall was her own doing, and while I wouldn't celebrate it, I also wouldn't waste energy mourning the life she destroyed. The last time I saw Mia, it was by chance. I was at the grocery store, picking up a few things, when I spotted her in the next aisle. She looked thinner, her hair dull and unkempt, her face drawn with stress. She didn't notice me at first, but when our eyes met, she froze. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then, she offered a weak smile, almost apologetic, and opened her mouth to speak. I turned and walked away before she could say a word. Mia's collapse was complete. Without financial support, without friends, without the marriage she had taken for granted, she was a shadow of the woman I had once loved. But as I walked out of the grocery store that day, I realized something important. I no longer cared. Mia had made her choices. Now, I was making mine. It's strange how life has a way of moving forward, even when you think it's come to a standstill. For months, my world had been defined by betrayal, anger, and the effort to rebuild. But as the dust began to settle, something unexpected started to take root. A connection I hadn't seen coming, one that would ultimately change everything. Sophia and I didn't set out to become close. At first, our relationship was purely practical, two people navigating the fallout of infidelity and the wreckage left by Eric and Mia. She was sharp and composed, her strength both intimidating and admirable. And while I admired her resilience, I never thought we'd become anything more than allies in the chaos. But as the weeks turned into months, we started leaning on each other in ways I didn't anticipate. It began with casual check-ins. Sophia would text to ask if I'd heard from Eric, or I'd call to update her on something Mia had done. Those conversations, once purely logistical, began to drift into personal territory. "Do you ever wonder if they even thought about what they were destroying?" I asked one evening over coffee at her house. "All the time," she replied, staring into her mug. "But I've stopped expecting answers from people who don't care about consequences." That was Sophia, blunt, honest, and unwilling to waste time on people who didn't deserve it. Her perspective was refreshing, a stark contrast to the manipulative mess Mia had turned our marriage into. As our conversations deepened, so did our understanding of each other. We both carried scars, though they were different in shape and depth. Sophia spoke about the early days of her marriage to Eric, how his charm had masked his selfishness, and how she'd ignored the red flags because she believed in the person she thought he could be. I shared stories of my own, how Mia's laughter had once been my favorite sound, how I'd ignored her increasing distance because I was too busy trying to be the husband I thought she wanted. "You're too hard on yourself," Sophia said one evening. "Mia didn't betray you because you weren't enough. She betrayed you because she didn't value what she had."